saloon doors banged open like a gunshot. Eliza Morrow shoved his daughter forward into the Wyoming dusk. "Take her," he barked, spitting near the moccasins of the Cheyenne warrior. "Settles my debt. Consider it charity. She's too much, too heavy for any decent man here." Eliza Morrow stood frozen. The townsfolk stares like hot brands on her skin. The warrior, Talon, said nothing. His dark eyes, fathomless as a winter night, swept over her trembling form. What kind of man accepts a woman discarded like spoiled goods? The silence stretched, brittle as thin ice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. Dust, thick and choking as regret, settled over Bear Ridge long before sunset. It coated the false-fronted buildings, gritted between the teeth of the few souls braving the wind, and seeped into the very bones of Eliza Morrow, standing rigid beside her father's monstrous black gelding. The humiliation in the saloon doorway had been a public flaying, but the journey back to the sprawling, hateful expanse of the Morrow Ranch was a private torture. Elias hadn't spoken a word since his pronouncement, his jaw clenched like granite, the reins held taut in his gloved fists. He rode as if fleeing a pestilence, and Eliza, her sturdy frame feeling ungainly atop the smaller mare forced upon her, was that pestilence. The Morrow Ranch sprawled across a valley the Cheyenne called Wyoming, Coyote's playground. To Elias, it was simply his. 10,000 acres rested from the wilderness and the people who understood it, bought with blood and ruthless ambition. The main house, a sprawling edifice of imported timber and pretension, hunched on a rise like a brooding vulture. It was a monument to Elias's success, and to Eliza, a gilded cage built on shifting sand. Her mother, Eleanor, had called it a promise. Eliza remembered her voice, soft as sagebrush in moonlight, tinged with melancholy Eliza only understood years later. Eleanor, too, had been deemed unsuitable by the finer families back east, her spirit too vibrant, her laughter too loud, her love for Elias too all-consuming for a man whose ambition eclipsed everything else. She'd withered slowly, like a wildflower transplanted to barren soil, her defiance turning to quiet despair before consumption claimed her when Eliza was 12. Elias had buried her without ceremony beside the collapsed root cellar, a place he deemed unfit for viewing. The memory was a cold stone in Eliza's chest, heavier than any judgment about her body. Her body, that was the unforgivable sin. Not her sharp mind that kept the ranch accounts flawlessly, nor her quiet competence with horses, nor the intricate embroidery she did by lamplight. Echoes of her mother's restless hands. No, it was the fullness of her hips, the roundness of her face, the softness deemed excessive in a frontier obsessed with spare survival and rigid conformity. Elias saw her as a failed investment, a reflection of Eleanor's perceived weakness made flesh. The townsfolk of Bear Ridge saw a spectacle, a source of cruel whispers and averted gazes. Solid. They'd murmur, a word that sounded like slow. Sturdy, they'd say, meaning unwanted. Too much Morrow in her, they conclude, the ultimate condemnation, linking her irrevocably to her father's despised, brutal nature. Disgrace had a sibling. Loss. Thomas, her younger brother, bright-eyed and reckless, who saw the land not as dominion, but as a playground. He'd vanished 5 years ago, just 14, chasing Mustangs into broken badlands north of the ranch. Search parties, led by a grim-faced Elias more concerned with the wasted effort than the lost boy, found only his favorite knife, the bone handle cracked, near a dry wash. Elias declared him dead, forbade further talk. But Eliza knew, in the stillness of night, she sometimes heard the phantom echo of Thomas's laughter carried on the wind, a sound that always dissolved into a mournful cry of a coyote. His absence was another weight, another space where love should have been. Now, standing in the cavernous, cold parlor of the Morrow house, facing her father as he poured whiskey with a hand that barely trembled, Eliza felt that weight threatened to crush her. The brass locket containing a faded wisp of Eleanor's hair felt like an accusation against her skin beneath her high-collared dress. "It's done," Elias stated, not looking at her. He took a long swallow. "Talon takes you at dawn. Consider it settled. That stretch of grazing land north of the bluffs is mine now, clear of any Cheyenne claim. Good bottomland. Water." His voice was flat, transactional. He was trading his unwanted daughter for prime acreage, facilitated by an old, unspoken debt. Years ago, during the brutal conflicts following the Bozeman Trail troubles, Elias had been cornered by a small band of young Cheyenne warriors, separated from his hunting party. Talon, then barely more than a youth himself, had intervened. He'd spoken words Elias didn't understand, gestured towards the setting sun, and the others had lowered their weapons. Elias, humiliated but alive, had spat out a promise of future payment. Talon had simply nodded, his expression unreadable. Now, the payment was called in. Eliza was the currency. "Why?" The word scraped from Eliza's throat, raw and barely audible. "Why this? Why him?" Elias finally turned, his eyes chips of blue ice. "Because you are a burden, Eliza, a constant reminder. No man of standing will have you. You eat, you take up space, you offer nothing." He gestured dismissively towards her figure. "Talon, he lives rough. He needs strong hands. Maybe he sees use where others see waste. Or maybe he just enjoys a bargain." A cruel smile touched his lips. "Don't mistake it for kindness. He's Cheyenne. Remember that. Savages, all of them, beneath the quiet. You step out of line, shame him." He paused, letting the thread hang in the air thick with the smell of dust, stale tobacco, and his own bitterness. "I'll hear of it, and I'll come for you, not to bring you back, girl, to remind you and him who owns what in this territory. You belong to me, even when you're in his teepee. Now get out. Pack what fits in one satchel. Nothing frivolous." Dawn arrived, painting the eastern sky in bruised hues of purple and orange. Eliza stood by the corral gate, a worn rawhide satchel at her feet, containing a spare dress, underthings, her mother's locket, her embroidery needles and thread, and Thomas's cracked-handled knife, her tiny arsenal of memory. She wore her sturdiest boots and a heavy woolen shawl against the biting chill. Talon emerged from the stable leading 2 horses, his own powerful dun and a calm, deep-chested bay mare. He wore simple buckskins, a rifle scabbard on his saddle, his face impassive beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He nodded once, a movement so slight Eliza almost missed it, and gestured toward the bay. Elias watched from the porch, a tin mug of coffee steaming in his hand, his expression one of grim satisfaction. A few ranch hands lingered near the bunkhouse, their faces carefully blank. No farewells, no good wishes, just the rasp of the wind through the skeletal branches of the stunted junipers that dotted the yard. Talon secured Eliza's satchel behind her saddle. He didn't offer to help her mount. She gathered her skirts, placed a foot in the stirrup, and hauled herself up, the familiar ache of judgment burning in her cheeks despite the absence of mocking eyes. The bay shifted patiently. Talon swung onto the dun with fluid grace. Without a backward glance, he nudged his horse forward, heading northwest, away from the oppressive bulk of the ranch house, away from the life that had rejected her. Eliza touched her heels to the bay's sides, the movement kicking up a small plume of dust that hung in the still air like the ghost of her past. They rode in silence. The landscape unfolded, vast, harsh, breathtaking. Rolling sagebrush plains gave way to broken badlands, striped layers of ochre and rust rock rising like the bones of the earth. Snow still clung stubbornly in the deep shadows of canyons and on the highest, distant ridges, gleaming white under the strengthening sun. The air was thin, sharp, scented with sage, dust, and profound, ancient stillness. Eliza had never ventured this far from the ranch confines. The sheer scale was overwhelming, dwarfing her anxieties yet amplifying her vulnerability. She was adrift in an indifferent sea of rock and sky. Talon rode slightly ahead, his posture relaxed but alert, scanning the horizons, the draws, the skyline. He moved with the land, not against it. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the sun's slow arc, the rhythmic plod of hooves on gravel and hardpan, and the cry of a circling hawk. Eliza's muscles ached. Her eyes stung from dust and unshed tears. The cold seeped through her shawl. She felt exposed, a clumsy intruder in this ancient rhythm. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in fiery gold and crimson, Talon reined in beside a small, ice-edged stream trickling through a sheltered draw. He dismounted silently, loosening the dun's girth. Eliza clumsily followed suit, her legs stiff. He walked to the stream, filled a canteen made from a cured buffalo bladder, and brought it to her. He didn't speak, simply held it out. His eyes, when they met hers, held no pity, no scorn, just a quiet, assessing look. It wasn't the leering appraisal of Bear Ridge men, nor the disgusted dismissal of her father. It was neutral, observant. She took the canteen, the rough hide warm from his hand. The water was achingly cold, pure, a simple act, a profound contrast. He spread a worn, thick woolen blanket, dyed a deep, earthy red with geometric patterns in black and white. Near a cluster of large, sun-warmed boulders that offered shelter from the wind, he gestured for her to sit. He then busied himself gathering dry sagebrush and juniper twigs, building a small, efficient fire with practiced ease. The flame snapped and crackled, pushing back the gathering twilight chill. He took dried meat and pemmican from his saddlebags, offering her a portion on a piece of clean rawhide. Still, he said nothing. The silence wasn't oppressive. It was a space filled with the wind's sigh, the fire's whisper, the distant yip of a coyote. Eliza ate, the rich pemmican unfamiliar, but welcome. She watched the flames dance, the first flicker of something other than dread or shame stirring in her chest, bewilderment, perhaps, curiosity. They rode for 2 more days, the land climbing steadily. The air grew thinner, colder. Juniper gave way to stunted pines. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a high ridge. Below, cradled in a wide valley shielded by steep, pine-clad slopes dusted with snow, lay the Cheyenne camp. Teepees, perhaps 30 or 40, rose like pale cones against the dark green of the pines, smoke spiraling lazily from their tops into the crisp blue sky. The valley floor was a patchwork of autumn yellow grass and sheltered stands of trees. A larger creek, partially frozen at its edges, wound through center. It looked peaceful, ordered, alive in a way Bear Ridge never did. As they descended the winding trail, a stillness seemed to settle over the camp. Figures emerged from teepees or paused in their tasks. Women scraping hides, children playing near the creek, men working on weapons or gear. Eyes followed their approach. Eliza felt the weight of their collective gaze, a different kind of scrutiny, not the familiar, sharp-edged mockery of Bear Ridge, but something deeper, more measured. Apprehension coiled in her stomach. Would they see only her father's cast-off? The white woman, heavy and useless? Talon led them towards a teepee set slightly apart near the base of a towering granite outcrop. It was larger than most, painted with faded symbols. A running horse, circles like suns, zigzags like lightning. An older woman, her face a map of deep lines, but her eyes bright and sharp as obsidian, stood waiting outside. She wore a beautifully quilled deerskin dress. Her gray hair was braided tightly. She watched Talon, then her gaze shifted to Eliza, lingering, assessing. This, Eliza sensed, was someone of importance. Talon dismounted and spoke softly to the woman in the Cheyenne tongue. Eliza caught only her name, or what sounded like it, Vikisi, Morning Star. The woman's expression remained unreadable, but she gave a single, slow nod. Talon turned to Eliza and gestured for her to dismount. Eliza slid down, her legs trembling slightly from the daze in the saddle and the intensity of the moment. The camp was quiet now, the only sound to crackle of distant fires, the murmur of the creek and the sigh of the wind in the pines high above. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying meat, and the pungent scent of tanned hides. Talon took the reins of her horse. He looked at her, then at the teepee entrance covered by a heavy buffalo hide flap. He made a small gesture towards it, a silent invitation, or an order. Eliza hesitated, clutching her worn satchel, the brass locket cold against her skin. This was her new world, a world of strangers, of unknown customs, of a man whose silence was as deep as the Wyoming sky, a world where her father's shadow, she knew, still stretched long. Talon began leading the horses towards a picket line. Morning Star remained, her gaze fixed on Eliza, expectant. Eliza took a shaky breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She took a step towards the teepee, then another. As she reached the heavy flap, a sound sliced through the valley's stillness, distant, sharp, unmistakable. The crack of a rifle shot, echoing off the granite slopes. Then another, coming from the direction of the ridge they just descended. Eliza froze, her blood turning to ice. Morning Star's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. Talon spun around, hand flying to his rifle stock, his gaze instantly scanning the tree line high above the camp. His expression, for the first time, was not impassive. It was sharp, alert, dangerous. The quiet of the valley shattered, replaced by a tension as taut as a bowstring. Someone was out there, watching, shooting. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. "I'll hear of it, and I'll come for you." Had he sent someone already? Or was this a threat from another quarter? The fragile sense of tentative safety evaporated, leaving only cold fear and the echo of gunfire hanging in the thin mountain air. The rifle shots, sharp and alien in the valley's sacred silence, hung in the thin air like a curse. Eliza's hand froze inches from the heavy buffalo hide flap of Talon's teepee, her blood turning to ice water. Instinct screamed run, hide, but her feet felt rooted to the frozen earth. Across the small space, Morning Star's obsidian-sharp eyes snapped towards the sound, her lined face hardening into a mask of ancient vigilance. But it was Talon who moved. He was a blur of controlled urgency. One moment, he was securing the horses, his back to the ridge. The next he had spun, his rifle already unsheathed and held low, his body coiled like a spring. His gaze, usually as deep and still as a mountain lake, was now a hunter's scan, sweeping the tree line high above, tracing the rocky outcrops, assessing the wind. The quiet acceptance of moments before was gone, replaced by a palpable tension that vibrated through the camp. Figures emerged from other teepees, warriors materializing with bows or rifles, women ushering children inside with swift, practiced motions. The peaceful valley of Ihoano, Coyote's playground, braced itself. Talon barked a series of short, guttural commands in Cheyenne. Two younger warriors, lean and swift as cougars, detached themselves from the gathering crowd and melted into the scrub at the valley's edge, heading toward the base of the ridge on silent feet. Another man, older, with a face like weathered saddle leather, moved toward the horses, his movements deliberate. Talon's eyes flickered towards Eliza, then to Morning Star. A single, almost imperceptible nod passed between the elder woman and the warrior. Morning Star stepped forward, placing a surprisingly strong, work-roughened hand on Eliza's arm. Her touch was firm, not unkind, but brooked no resistance. Inside, Morning Star said in heavily accented English, her voice low and gravelly. She pushed aside the flap, revealing the dim, smoke-scented interior. The command was clear. Safety lay within the painted hide walls. Eliza stumbled in, the sudden dimness after the bright afternoon light momentarily blinding her. The air inside was warmer, thick with the scent of sage, cured leather, and wood smoke. Morning Star followed, letting the flap fall, plunging them into near darkness save for the faint glow of coals in a central fire pit. Outside, the silence was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the frantic pounding of Eliza's own heart. Her father's words echoed, venomous. "I'll hear of it, and I'll come for you." Had it begun so soon? Time stretched, elastic and agonizing. Eliza stood just inside the entrance, clutching her satchel like a shield, the brass locket a cold disc against her skin. She strained to hear any sound beyond the hide walls. A shout, another shot, the thud of hooves. Images flashed unbidden. Elias's cold blue eyes, the scornful stares in Bear Ridge, Thomas's laughing face dissolving into the dust of the Badlands. Her mother, Eleanor, sitting by a window in the Morrow house, her embroidery hoop forgotten in her lap, gazing out at the land she'd once loved with a heartbreaking longing. "It's freedom, Eliza," she whispered once, her voice thin with illness, pointing towards the distant mountains. "Real freedom isn't owning land. It's belonging to it." The memory was a fresh wound. Did belonging feel like this? Trapped in a stranger's teepee, hunted by her own blood? Morning Star moved silently to the fire pit, adding a few small sticks to the embers. A tiny flame licked up, casting flickering shadows on the painted symbols inside the teepee. The running horse, the sun circles, the jagged lightning. The elder woman watched the fire, her face impassive. But Eliza sensed a deep current of watchfulness beneath the calm. After what felt like an eternity, the flap stirred. Talon ducked inside. The sharp alertness hadn't left his eyes, but his movements were deliberate again. He carried something small, dark, in his hand. He nodded to Morning Star, then his gaze settled on Eliza. He didn't speak immediately, holding out the object. It was a spent rifle shell casing, brass gleaming dully in the firelight. Etched crudely into its base was a distinct mark, a crudum within a circle. The Morrow brand. Eliza's breath hitched. "My father's men," she whispered, the confirmation tasting like ash. The brand was burned onto cattle, tack, even tools. Seeing it here, on evidence of violence aimed at the camp or at her, was a visceral blow. The debt was paid, the land taken. Why pursue? To intimidate? To ensure her misery? Or simply because Eliza Morrow could not tolerate anything escaping his control, even something he discarded? Talon turned the casing in his fingers, his expression unreadable. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in the small space. One man, watching. He gestured toward the ridge with the casing. Tracks lead east, toward Bear Ridge. He paused, his dark eyes meeting Eliza's. "Jed Coombs. Know him." Eliza nodded, a chill spreading through her despite the fire's warmth. Jed Coombs, a lean, weasel-faced man who handled Elias's less savory tasks, intimidating settlers off desirable parcels, discouraging Cheyenne hunting parties near Morrow water sources. Ruthless, efficient, and utterly loyal to her father's coin. His presence was a direct message. Elias was watching. Morning Star made a soft, disapproving sound deep in her throat. She spoke rapidly in Cheyenne to Talon. Eliza caught the name VOE, Coyote, but spoken with a tone that suggested trickster, thief, a bringer of trouble. Talon listened, then gave a curt nod. He looked back at Eliza. "He watches. We watch." It was a statement of fact, not reassurance. The fragile peace was shattered. The camp remained tense but purposeful through the afternoon. Talon moved among the men, speaking quietly, directing sentry placements. Eliza, feeling useless and exposed, retreated to a pile of tan hides near the back of the teepee. Morning Star, observing her agitation, brought her a bundle of sinew and a pile of softened, dyed porcupine quills. Deep blues, reds, yellows, and whites. She pointed to an unfinished pattern on a strip of leather laid across a wooden frame, intricate geometric lines partially filled in. "Hands busy," Morning Star said simply, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Mind quiet. Grateful for distraction, Eliza picked up a slender bone awl. The work was delicate, demanding focus. Pushing the awl through the tough leather, threading the sinew, then carefully adding each quill in the designated pattern. It reminded her, achingly, of her embroidery back at the ranch, the only thing that had ever quieted the storm of her father's disapproval and her own loneliness. As her fingers found rhythm, her breathing slowly evened. She stole glances at Talon when he returned. He checked his rifle, meticulously cleaned the barrel, his movements economical and precise. He didn't look at her, but his presence was a solid anchor in the swirling fear. Later, as dusk painted the smoke hole above in hues of violet and charcoal, Talon gestured for Eliza to follow him outside. The camp was settling, cook fires glowing like fallen stars against the deepening twilight. Frost was already glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds, and the air held a sharp, clean bite of impending winter. He led her towards a frozen creek, away from the main cluster of teepees. He stopped near a stand of skeletal willows, their branches etched black against the fading sky. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge, now a dark silhouette against the bruised horizon. "Years passed," he began, his voice low, almost lost in the vastness. "Your father, trapped. Young men, angry. Blood hot." He picked up a smooth, flat stone from the creek bank, turning it over in his hand. They saw enemy, land taker. I saw a man, afraid. He looked down at the stone, then skimmed it expertly across the ice-crusted edge of the creek. It skipped once, twice, then vanished into the shadows with a soft plink. Not honor in killing fear, only more fear. He met her eyes then, a flicker of something ancient and weary in his own. Debt paid. Land for her. He gestured vaguely towards her, then back toward the ridge where Jed Coons had watched. This not honor. This, coyote, trickery, poison. Eliza understood. He had spared Elias not out of weakness, but out of a different kind of strength. A refusal to perpetuate a cycle of fear and violence. And her father had repaid that restraint with this, using her as currency and then sending a viper to watch the transaction. Shame, hot and fierce, burned her cheeks, not for herself this time, but for the blood she shared. "He doesn't understand honor," she whispered, the wind snatching at her words. Only control. Talon held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He saw her understanding, perhaps even her shared shame for her father's actions. He gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't warmth exactly, but a deepening of the quiet respect he'd shown since the saloon. He turned to head back towards the teepee. As they walked, Eliza's boot caught on a half-buried root. She stumbled forward with a gasp, throwing out her hands to break her fall. She landed hard on her knees on the frost-rimed earth, a jolt of pain shooting through her right palm. She hissed, clutching it to her chest. Talon was instantly beside her, not touching but close. He crouched, his gaze intent on her injured hand. "Show!" he commanded softly. Reluctantly, Eliza uncurled her fingers. A jagged gash, not deep but bleeding freely, marred her palm, filled with grit and a sliver of wood from the root. She winced, tears of pain and frustration stinging her eyes. Talon reached into a small pouch at his belt. He pulled out a twist of dried leaves and a tiny horn container. Crushing the leaves between his fingers, he sprinkled the fragrant green powder onto the wound. Then from a horn, he poured a few drops of clear liquid that stung fiercely but cleansed the grit. Finally, he tore a narrow strip from the bottom of his own buckskin shirt and, with surprising gentleness, bound her hand. His touch was firm, competent, impersonal. Yet, in that moment, kneeling in the freezing dusk, his quiet ministrations felt like the first true kindness she'd known in years. Not pity, but necessary care. A lump formed in her throat. "Nahain," he murmured, securing the bandage. It sounded like it passes or heals. "Thank you." Eliza breathed, her voice thick. He helped her to her feet, his hand under her elbow steady and brief. As they approached the teepee, the smell of simmering stew greeted them, a comforting counterpoint to the day's tension. Morning Star stood by the fire, stirring the pot. She glanced at Eliza's bandaged hand, then at Talon, her expression unreadable. She dipped a horn cup into the stew and handed it to Eliza without a word. The simple act, The warmth of the cup, the savory aroma. It felt like an offering, however small, of belonging. That night, wrapped in the thick, earth-red wool blanket Talon had given her on the trail, Eliza lay near the fire pit. Talon sat cross-legged near the entrance, his rifle across his knees, a silhouette against the hide flap, where a sliver of starlight peeked through. Morning Star slept soundly nearby. The camp outside was quiet, but the sentries were there unseen. Eliza's hand throbbed dully, a reminder of the fall of Talon's unexpected care. She thought of his words by the creek, the weight of the choice he'd made years ago, the bitter taste of her father's betrayal of that fragile truce. She thought of her mother's yearning for belonging, and Thomas, lost to the indifferent land. Was this harsh valley, this painted hide shelter, her belonging? It felt terrifyingly uncertain, yet the warrior guarding the door, the elder sharing food, the quiet rhythm of the camp, it held a different kind of promise than the gilded cage of the Morrow ranch. Sleep was a restless visitor, dreams fragmented, her father's cold laugh, the crack of the rifle, Thomas calling from a great distance, the feel of Talon's hands binding her wound. She woke with a start sometime deep in the night. The fire was embers. Talon was still at his post, a statue carved from shadow. Then she saw it, through the small gap in the teepee flap, high on the eastern ridge, a flicker, not starlight, orange, unsteady, growing. She sat bolt upright, her bandaged hand pressed to her mouth. Talon was already moving, silently lifting the flap just enough to see out. His body tensed. On the distant ridge, stark against the black velvet of the night, a fire burned. Not a campfire, a signal fire. One solitary, defiant blaze, casting long, dancing shadows down a rocky slope. It was too far to threaten the camp directly, but its message was as clear and violent as the rifle shots. We are here. We are watching. We are coming. Talon let the flap fall. In the sudden, suffocating darkness of the teepee, broken only by the ember's dying glow, Eliza heard his breath catch, a soft, sharp intake. He didn't turn, but his silhouette seemed to grow larger, harder, etched against the faint light from the signal fire bleeding through the hide. The silent guardian had become something else entirely, a warrior facing a declared enemy. The fragile piece of Coyote's playground was over. The fire on the ridge wasn't just a signal. It was a declaration of war, and Eliza Morrow, bound by blood to the man who lit it, lay trapped at its heart. The signal fire's orange eye glared from the eastern ridge, a malevolent beacon in the velvet night. Its light, flickering and defiant, bled to the gap in the teepee flap, painting Talon's silhouette in stark, shifting relief. That single, sharp intake of breath was the only sound he made, but the air inside the hide shelter thickened instantly, charged with the silent thunder of impending conflict. Eliza huddled under the earth-red blanket, the ruffle scratchy against her skin, her bandaged hand throbbing in time with her racing heart. The fragile sense of tentative safety, built over days of quiet travel and Talon's unexpected care, evaporated like mist under a harsh sun. He is coming. Talon didn't move for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant, accusing flame. Then, with the fluid grace of predator, he rose. He didn't speak to Eliza or the now-awake Morning Star, whose eyes reflected the firelight with grim understanding. He simply lifted the flap and slipped out into the frigid night, merging with the deeper shadows beyond. The camp, already on edge, stirred fully awake. Low voices murmured, urgent and tense. The soft crunch of snow under moccasined feet, the metallic snick of a rifle bolt, the nervous whicker of a picketed horse. These sounds replaced the previous deep silence of the O&O. Eliza pushed back the blanket, the cold air biting through her dress. Morning Star was already adding wood to the embers, coaxing a small, defiant flame. The elder woman's face was a mask of stoic resolve. Dress warm, Morning Star instructed, her voice low but firm. She gestured towards Eliza's boots and shawl. Work waits. Cold bites harder than fear. Eliza obeyed, her fingers clumsy with cold and residual shock. She tied her shawl tightly, the familiar weight offering scant comfort. Outside, the world was a monochrome landscape of black shadows and blue-white snow. The ridge fire a lurid punctuation mark. Figures moved purposefully in the gloom, warriors checking weapons, women bundling children toward the center of the camp, older boys helping drive horses into a more defensible position behind the granite outcrop near Talon's teepee. The air crackled with a different energy now, not peace, but preparation. Talon reappeared, frost glistening on his shoulders and the brim of his hat. He spoke rapidly to Morningstar in Cheyenne. Eliza caught the name Behoe again, and the word Mazil Kota, many men, or perhaps big trouble. Morningstar nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Talon's gaze swept over Eliza. "Come," he said, his voice carrying a night's chill. He didn't wait for acknowledgement, turning back towards the creek. Eliza followed, stumbling slightly in the uneven snow. He led her not toward the ridge, but downstream, away from the main camp activity, toward a cluster of large, snow-dusted boulders near the partially frozen watercourse. The creek gurgled darkly beneath its icy skin, a counterpoint to the tense silence. Talon stopped beside a deep drift piled against one boulder. He crouched, brushing snow away with a gloved hand, revealing not rock, but tightly wrapped bundles of dried meat and pemmican, cleverly cached against the cold stone. "Our winter teeth," he stated flatly, his breath frosting in the air. "Enemy knows hunger wins battles." He began pulling bundles out, handing them to Eliza. "Take to Morningstar. Hide inside, deep." Eliza's mind reeled. Sabotage? Starving them out? It was a coward's tactic, utterly her father's style. Shame wore with a rising anger, hot and unfamiliar. She accepted the heavy bundles, the weight grounding her, as she turned to carry the first load back. Her boots scuffed against something half buried near the base of the drift. Not snow, not rock. Something dark and fibrous. She paused, bending down, brushing aside the powdery snow. It was a coil of rope, new and strong, but clumsily hidden. And beside it, partially obscured, were several large, sharp metal traps, bear traps, their cruel jaws glinting dully in the starlight. Traps Elias used near his cattle pens to deter wolves or trespassers. "Talon," she breathed, her voice tight. He was instantly beside her, his eyes narrowing as he saw the rope, then the traps. He picked up one of the heavy contraptions, testing the spring mechanism with a cautious thumb. It was oiled ready. "Not just hunger," Eliza whispered, the implications chilling her more than the wind. They meant to cripple. Horses? People? The image of the powerful dun or the gentle bay mare stepping onto those serrated jaws. The camp children running. It was unspeakable. Her father's reach, his malice, felt suffocating. Talon's expression hardened, a flicker of cold fury in his dark eyes. He swiftly covered the traps and rope again with snow, marking the spot subtly with a broken branch. "Quiet," he murmured. "We know their snake thoughts now." He took the bundles of food from her arms. "Go. Tell Morningstar only about food. Hide it well. The traps council knows." The word council held weight. This was beyond a watchful eye. This was an act of war requiring the band's decision. The council fire burned in the center of the camp, larger now, pushing back the pre-dawn gloom. Elders, including Morningstar, and key warriors sat in a circle, their faces etched with worry and resolve in the flickering light. Talon stood, the brass shell casing with them brand held aloft, then described the discovered cache sabotage and the hidden traps. A ripple of anger, low and dangerous, went through the gathered men. Eliza, sitting slightly outside the circle near Morningstar, translating quietly for the elder, felt a collective gaze shift towards her. Not hostile, not yet, but heavy with the knowledge of the blood she carried. The outsider, the catalyst, an elder with a deeply lined face and eyes like chips of flint. Lean Bear, Eliza heard him called, spoke sharply in Cheyenne, gesturing toward the ridge fire, now just embers but its message lingering. Morning Star responded, her voice calm but firm. Eliza caught the word Vihoe again, and Vixie, Morning Star, defending something. Defending her? Lean Bear's gaze swept over Eliza, lingering on her bandaged hand, then back to Talon. He spoke again, his tone questioning, challenging. Talon stepped forward into the firelight. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried, resonant and certain. He spoke of the debt settled, the land given. He spoke of the cowardice of hidden traps and poisoned caches. He gestured toward Eliza, not as a rancher's daughter, but simply as Nakoi, the one who found the snake's poison. She sees with clear eyes, he stated, his gaze meeting Lean Bear's, eyes not clouded by Vihoe smoke. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped, carrying a weight of personal history. Years ago, Blue Creek raid. Settlers took horses. Took Nakoi Vihoe, my woman, my wife. The words hung in the frosty air, a revelation carved from grief. I rode for blood, found only fear in their eyes. Children hiding, like Thomas Morrow lost. He looked directly at Eliza, acknowledging the shared specter of loss she carried. Killing fear breeds only more fear. Like traps breed pain. We fight the poison, not the scared ones. We fight the source. He pointed east towards Bear Ridge. Eliza Morrow, his hired snakes. They bring the poison. We cut the head. A profound silence followed. The crackle of the fires seemed loud. Lean Bear studied Talon, then slowly nodded, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. The tension in the circle shifted, solidifying into a grim unity. The plan was set. Fortify, watch, wait for Morrow's move, but strike decisively at the instigator when the time came. Eliza sat frozen, absorbing Talon's revelation. His wife, lost to settler violence. And yet, he'd spared her father. He saw the fear behind the cruelty, the cycle she was now trapped within. His restraint wasn't weakness. It was a terrible, hard-won strength. A lump rose in her throat, part grief for his loss, part awe at his resilience, part a fierce, protective surge she didn't fully understand. The rest of the day blurred into a tense flurry of activity. Eliza worked alongside the women, her injured hand carefully protected. She helped dig shallow, camouflage pits near likely approach paths, not for traps, but to break a horse's leg or a man's charge. She carried stones to bolster makeshift breastworks behind the outcrop. She hauled water from the creek, the icy water numbing her fingers. No one spoke much. The shared labor was its own language, a forging of necessity. Kaya, a young woman with keen eyes and a quiet intensity, showed Eliza how to weave extra sinew into bindings of hide shields, making them tougher. Their hands worked side by side, and though Kaya's gaze held a lingering wariness, it lacked the open hostility Eliza feared. Acceptance, perhaps, was being earned one task at a time. As dusk settled like a heavy gray blanket, a shout came from the northern sentry post. A single rider approached, moving slowly, cautiously, holding a branch aloft, a sign of parley, not attack. Talon and two warriors moved out to meet him on the open ground before the camp. Eliza watched from behind the relative safety of the stacked firewood, her heart hammering. The rider wasn't Jed Coombs. It was a younger man she vaguely recognized from the Morrow Ranch. Billy Sears, more stable hand than gun hand, his face pale under his hat brim. Talon stopped a dozen paces away, rifle held loosely but ready. The young man reined in, holding the branch higher. Message from Mr. Morrow, he called out, his voice trembling slightly. Speak, Talon commanded, his voice like stone. Billy swallowed hard. He says the debt was land for the woman. He says he hears she's causing trouble, stirring things up. Billy's eyes darted nervously towards the camp, perhaps seeking Eliza. He wants her back. Now. Says if she ain't handed over by dawn tomorrow, he'll burn this valley clean. every teepee, every horse. The threat hung, ugly and final, in the cold air. He says it's the only way to restore order, to make things right. A ripple of fury went through the watching Cheyenne. Talon didn't move, but Eliza saw the muscle clench in his jaw. Elias wasn't just watching. He was dictating terms, using her as the excuse for the destruction he'd always planned. The shame was a physical weight, crushing. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. Talon took a single step forward. "Tell Eliza Morrow," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, carrying clearly in the stillness. "The debt is paid. The land is his. The woman, Nakohi, is not his to reclaim. She stays." He paused, his gaze boring into the young rider. "Tell him if he brings fire to this valley, he brings his own death. Tell him Talon remembers Blue Creek. Tell him the debt of blood remains unpaid." Billy Sears paled further. He fumbled with the reins, his horse sidestepping nervously. He opened his mouth as if to argue, saw the implacable wall of warriors behind Talon, and thought better of it. With a jerky nod, he yanked his horse's head around and spurred it back the way he came, disappearing into the gathering twilight, like a ghost fleeing judgment. Silence descended again, deeper and more ominous than before. The ultimatum had been delivered. Dawn was the deadline. The camp braced, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, cold earth, and impending violence. Sentries were doubled. Children were kept close. Eliza moved through the preparations, Talon's fierce declaration. She stays, echoing in her mind, a fragile lifeline in the storm of her father's hatred. Deep in the night, under a sky dense with stars that seemed to watch with cold indifference, Eliza found herself near the creek again, refilling water skins. The moon, a thin sliver, cast weak, deceptive light. She was bending to dip a skin when a flicker of movement caught her eye downstream, near the boulders where the traps had been hidden. Not an animal. A man shape, crouched low, moving with furtive intent toward the camp's horse picket line. The moonlight glinted dully off metal in his hand. Not a rifle. A knife, and slung across his back, a coiled shape she recognized, rope. Jed Coombs. He hadn't waited for dawn. He was here now, a viper in the dark, aiming to cripple their horses, their mobility, their hope. Terror locked Eliza's breath in her throat. She was alone, weaponless, too far from the nearest sentry to call out without alerting him. Coombs was almost at the picket line, his shadow merging with the deeper shadows of the sleeping horses. One of them snorted softly, sensing danger. Eliza acted without thought. Her hand closed around the only thing within reach, a smooth, heavy stone from the creek bed, cold and solid. She drew back her arm, the memory of Thomas teaching her to skip stones flooding her. "Put your weight into it, Liza," and threw with all her strength, not at Coombs, but at the large metal cooking pot hanging from a tripod near the central fire, 20 yards behind him. The stone struck the pot with a resounding, clarion clang that shattered the night's silence like gunfire. Coombs jerked upright, spinning around, knife raised. Horses snorted and stamped in alarm. From the sentry post near the outcrop, a shout rang out. A rifle barked, the muzzle flashed briefly, illuminating the startled, furious face of Jed Coombs as he realized he'd been discovered. He didn't hesitate. With a snarl, he lunged not toward the horses, but straight towards the source of sound. Straight towards Eliza, frozen now in the moonlight by the creek, the water skin forgotten her feet, her father's enforcer charging with murder in his eyes and a knife gleaming in his fist. Jed Coombs moved like a striking snake, closing the distance between the frozen creek bed and Eliza with terrifying speed. His knife, a cruel shard of reflected moonlight, was aimed straight for her heart. Eliza's world narrowed to the glint of steel, the snarl twisting his weasel face, the pounding of her own blood roaring in her ears. She scrambled backwards, her boots slipping on the icy stones, the forgotten water skin tangling around her ankles. Time stretched, thin and brittle. She heard the frantic shouts from the camp, the alarmed whinnies of horses. but they seemed distant, muffled. Death wore her father's brand and lunged with Jed Coombs's wiry arm. Then, a shadow darker than the night itself erupted from the willows to her left. Talon. He moved with the silent fury of a mountain cat, intercepting Coombs's charge not with blade, but with sheer, devastating momentum. He slammed into the smaller man's side, driving him off course with a grunt of impact. Coombs's knife flashed harmlessly wide, slicing air inches from Eliza's shoulder. They crashed to the frozen ground in a tangle of limbs, rolling violently towards the creek's icy edge. Coombs, wiry and vicious, writhed like an eel, trying to bring his knife up. Talon pinned the knife arm with a forearm like iron, his other hand closing around Coombs's throat. Coombs gagged, kicking wildly, his boot connecting hard with Talon's ribs. Talon barely flinched, his face a mask of cold, focused rage. This wasn't just offense, it was retribution for the poisoned caches, the hidden traps, the threat to his people, and the woman trembling nearby. Eliza, freed from the paralyzing terror, saw her chance. Thomas's cracked-handle knife was in her satchel, lying where she dropped it. She dove for it, her fingers fumbling with the rawhide tie. Her bandaged hand screamed in protest, but she ignored it. Thomas, she thought, a desperate plea to the ghost of her brother. Help me now. The knife slid free, cool bone handle fitting awkwardly in her uninjured palm. She scrambled towards the struggling men. Talon had Coombs mostly pinned, but the man was still thrashing, his free hand clawing at Talon's face, his teeth snapping. Eliza saw the opening, not to stab, but to disarm. She brought the heavy bone handle of Thomas's knife down with all her strength onto Coombs's knife wrist. There was a sickening crack. Coombs howled, a raw, animal sound of pain. The knife fell from his spasming fingers, clattering onto the frost-rimed stones. Instantly, 2 Cheyenne warriors were there, pulling Coombs off Talon. They hauled the whimpering, cursing man upright, binding his arms tightly behind him with the very rope he'd brought to cripple their horses. Talon rose slowly, breathing hard, one hand pressed briefly to his ribs where Coombs had kicked him. His dark eyes met Eliza's. In the chaotic moonlight, she saw it. Not just relief, but fierce, blazing approval. She had acted. She had fought back. She had helped. You are hurt. Eliza stammered, clutching Thomas's knife, her whole body trembling now that the immediate danger was past. Talon shook his head once, a sharp negation. His gaze shifted to Coombs, now being dragged toward the camp center, spewing venomous threats in Eliza Morrow's name. The fury in Talon's eyes was banked, but far from extinguished. Snake caught, he stated, his voice rough, but nest still stirs. He looked east, towards the unseen ridge where dawn was still hours away. Elias's ultimatum hung heavy in the cold air. The camp was fully roused now, tense as a drawn bowstring. Torches flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Coombs was bound securely to a sturdy lodgepole pine near the council fire, under heavy guard. His presence was a festering wound, a tangible symbol of the Morrow threat within their sanctuary. Morning Star approached Eliza, her keen eyes taking the knife in her hand, her disheveled state, the terror slowly receding from her eyes. Strong hands, Morning Star said, her voice low and gravelly. She reached out and gently touched the bone handle of the knife Eliza still clutched like a talisman. Strong spirit. It wasn't effusive praise, but it carried the weight of genuine acknowledgement. Kaya appeared beside Morning Star, handing Eliza a horn cup of steaming, bitter-smelling tea. Her expression was less guarded than before, a flicker of respect replacing some of the wariness. Eliza accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into her icy fingers, the simple act of lifeline. Talon called a brief council near the fire. The captured snake changed things. Coombs, under the harsh, unyielding questioning of Lean Bear and another elder, spat out defiance and threats but confirmed Elias's plan. Cripple the horses, Salcas, then attack at dawn with a larger force to reclaim his property and burn the valley. His capture bought them time, but Elias wouldn't back down. The deadline still loomed. As the council dispersed to reinforce defenses, Talon gestured for Eliza to follow him again, this time downstream, away from the bound coons and the anxious activity. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds a crunch of frost underfoot and the gurgle of the creek beneath its thinning ice skin. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows of the willows. Eliza felt the weight of Talon's revelation about his wife pressing on her, a shared burden of loss. He stopped near a bend where the creek widened slightly, the water flowing clearer over smooth stones. He crouched, splashing icy water on his face, washing away the grime of the struggle. Eliza knelt nearby, the cold air sharp in her lungs. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion and a deep, gnawing guilt. "My father," she began, the words thick and painful. "His poison had hurt you all. Because of me." She couldn't meet his eyes, staring instead at the dark water swirling around her reflection, a distorted image of the unwanted daughter, the catalyst for violence. Talon was silent for a long moment. He picked up a smooth, flat stone, much like the one he'd skipped days before. "Water flows," he said finally, his voice quieter, stripped of its warrior's edge. "Poison flows with it, or not. Choice." He skipped the stone. It danced 3 times across the dark surface before vanishing. "Blue Creek, Amana, my woman." He spoke her name softly, a sacred sound in the stillness. She had a laugh like spring water, strong, like you. He looked at Eliza then, his dark eyes holding a depth of sorrow she could barely fathom. Settlers came, took horses, took her, found her after. Fear in their eyes then, but too late. Fear after breeds only ashes. He clenched his fist, the knuckles white. Your father, his fear is greed. His poison he chooses to spread, not your hand that throws it. Eliza's throat tightened. Amana, a name, a life, a love extinguished. And Talon saw strength in her? She thought of Eleanor, her mother, defying Elias's orders to ride out and see the wildflowers bloom one last spring before the illness truly took hold. "Some beauty is worth the risk, Eliza," she whispered, her eyes bright with fever and defiance. And Thomas, forever 12, sneaking out to watch the wild mustangs, his face alight with a joy forbidden by their father's rigid control. They had chosen life, however fleeting, over fear. Was she doing the same now? "Thomas, my brother," she whispered, the name feeling raw on her tongue. He loved the wild horses. Father forbade it. He went anyway. Vanished. Father, he didn't even look hard. She picked up a small stone, cold and smooth. He chose the land. Always the land. Over mother. Over Thomas. Over me. She threw her stone into the creek. It sank immediately with a soft plunk. I don't want to be his poison anymore." Talon watched the ripples spread and fade. He nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them in the moonlit silence. "You choose the water," he said, "not the poison." He stood, offering his hand, not to help her up, but in a gesture of shared purpose, of alliance. Eliza placed her hand in his, feeling the callous strength, the warmth despite the cold night. He pulled her gently to her feet. The simple connection was a balm, a silent vow. They walked back toward the camp. Side by side, the looming threat momentarily held at bay by the fragile understanding forged by shared grief and defiance. The camp was a hive of tense preparation. Sentries were posted in pairs now. Women and older children worked on final defenses. Kaya approached as they neared Talon's teepee, her face grim. "The creek," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Downstream, near the drinking place. Something wrong." She held out a small, stoppered clay vial. It was empty, but a faint, acrid, medicinal smell clung to it. "Found this, hidden in rocks. Water smells bitter now." Horror washed over Eliza. Poison. Jed Coombs hadn't just come for the horses. While the camp was distracted by his capture, Another of Elias's snakes had struck at their lifeblood, their water. The creek, their source, tainted. Panic threatened to rise. How much? How fast? Had anyone drunk? Talon took the vial, sniffing it cautiously. His expression hardened into granite. "VOE," he spat, the word dripping with contempt. Coward's weapon. He turned, barking orders. Water skins were begathered. Only the clean water already collected inside the camp was safe. Scouts were sent upstream to find the source of the contamination. The atmosphere, already taut, thickened with new layer of dread. Starvation they could fight. Thirst was a slower, crueler enemy. Morning Star emerged from her teepee, her sharp eyes taking in the commotion. Kaya showed her the vial, explaining rapidly. The elder woman's face remained impassive, but deep weariness settled in her eyes. She looked at Eliza, then at Talon. "Though he fears strength he cannot break," she said, her voice like dry leaves. "He poisons a wellspring to kill the tree. But roots run deep." She placed a hand briefly on Eliza's arm. "You are root here now, VKC? Morning light." The use of the Cheyenne name, tentative but deliberate, struck Eliza deeply. Before Eliza could process it, a cry came from the northern sentry post. Not an alarm, but a call. One of the scouts sent after Coombs's accomplice was returning. He rode hard into the camp, his horse lathered, his face etched with urgency. He slid from the saddle, gasping for breath, and spoke rapidly to Talon and Lean Bear, gesturing wildly back the way he'd come. Eliza watched Talon's face. The stoic mask didn't slip, but his shoulders stiffened, his grip tightening on his rifle. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the camp, taking the bound and glaring Jed Coombs, the worried faces, the poisoned creek, the gathered defenders, and finally settling on Eliza. The dawn was still a gray promise in the east, but Eliza Morrow wasn't waiting for its light. "They come," Talon announced, his voice cutting to the murmurs like a knife. He pointed toward the ridge, not where the signal fire had burned, but a lower pass to the northwest. "Not at dawn. Now. Many riders. Morrow's brand. And," he paused, his dark eyes locking onto Eliza's, carrying a terrible weight. "They have the boy, Billy Sears. Rope, a warning." The scout's words, they have the boy roped, a warning, hung in the pre-dawn air like the chill before a killing frost. Billy Sears, young and terrified, a pawn in her father's ruthless game. The fragile truce bought by Coombs's capture shattered utterly. Dawn was irrelevant. Eliza Morrow's violence was arriving now, carried on the hoofbeats echoing from a northwest pass. The camp snapped into final, lethal readiness. Torches were doused, plunging the valley into deceptive shadow, lit only by the fading stars and the thin sliver of moon. Warriors melted into the landscape, taking positions behind snowdrifts, boulders, and the fortified breastworks near the outcrop. Women and children retreated to the central teepees, armed with whatever they could wield: knives, stout sticks, rocks. Morning Star stood firm near the council fire's embers, a figure of unwavering calm, her voice a low murmur, steadying the younger ones. Jed Coombs, bound to the lodgepole pine, let out a harsh, mocking laugh that was quickly silenced by a warrior's sharp command. Talon stood at the edge of the camp, near the poisoned creek, his silhouette stark against the gray eastern horizon. Eliza moved to stand beside him. Thomas's cracked-handled knife held firmly in her good hand, her father's brass locket cold against her skin. The weight of the imminent storm pressed down, but the paralyzing fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She had chosen the water, not the poison. She would stand. "The pass," Talon murmured, his eyes scanning the dark tree-line of the lower ridge. "They funnel there. Narrow ground." He turned to Lean Bear and another warrior, issuing swift, guttural commands. They nodded, vanishing silently into the gloom, taking a handful of men with them. An ambush within the ambush. Talon's strategy was clear. Let Elias commit, then strike his flanks in confined space. The first sign was the jingle of harnesses carried on the still air. Then, the dark mass of riders emerged from the tree-line, spilling into the open slope leading down to the valley floor. Torches flared among them, held aloft, illuminating grim faces under hat brims, the glint of rifle barrels, and the unmistakable bulk of Eliza Morrow at their center, mounted on his massive black gelding. And there, tethered by a rope to Eliza's saddle horn, stumbling to keep pace, was Billy Sears, his face pale with terror in the torchlight. Elias reined in just beyond effective rifle range, his voice booming across the frozen distance, thick with contempt and the absolute certainty of his power. "Talon, you defied me. Hand over my daughter and the thief Coombs, and I might let your people slink away with their hides intact. Fail me, and I'll turn this wretched valley into a charnel house." He gestured dramatically with a gloved hand towards the camp, the torchlight catching the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. "That worthless girl belongs to me. Her defiance ends now." Eliza's blood ran cold, then hot. Worthless girl, the words that had defined her life. But hearing them shouted across this battlefield, seeing Billy's terror, smelling the acrid tang of the poison creek, it ignited something fierce and protective within her, not just for herself, but for these people, for this place that offered her a glimpse of belonging. Talon didn't shout back. He raised his rifle, a single, deliberate movement. It was answer enough. A shot cracked from the Morrow line, wild and high, a nervous trigger finger. It was a spark to the tinderbox. "Take them," Elias bellowed, spurring his horse forward. The charge began, a ragged line of riders kicking their horses into a gallop down the slope, guns blazing. Bullets whined through the air, thudding into snowdrifts and timber. The Cheyenne defenders held their fire, disciplined, invisible. Eliza crouched behind a stack of firewood near Talon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. She saw Kaya nearby, bow drawn, face set in fierce concentration. The leading Morrow riders hit the concealed pits dug near the base of the slope. Horses screamed, legs snapping, throwing riders into the snow with sickening thuds. Chaos erupted in the front ranks. It was a signal. From the Cheyenne lines, a volley of arrows and rifle fire sang out. More horses went down, men cried out. The charge faltered, bunching up in confusion on the treacherous ground. Elias, near the rear, roared in fury. Push through, damn you." He fired his pistol towards the Cheyenne positions. This was the moment Talon had waited for. A ululating cry rose from the left flank of the pass. Lean Bear and his warriors, erupting from their concealment among the rocks and snow-laden pines. They fell upon the stalled, bunched-up riders with terrifying speed and silence, knives and tomahawks flashing in the torchlight. Panic spread through the Morrow men. The orderly attack dissolved into a desperate, close-quarters melee. Eliza's eyes were fixed on her father and the struggling Billy Sears. Elias, seeing his men faltering, tried to wheel his big black horse around, perhaps to retreat, perhaps to use Billy as a shield. In the chaos, Billy stumbled, falling hard, the rope pulling taut. Elias cursed, yanking savagely on the rope, trying to drag the boy back onto his feet or simply drag him away. Rage, pure and blinding, surged through Eliza. He chooses a land, always a land. The memory of Thomas, lost and unlooked for, fused with the sight of Billy being treated like a piece of stubborn livestock. She didn't think. She moved, darting from behind the woodpile. She ran low and fast, not towards the thick of the fighting, but angling towards the struggling figures of Elias and Billy. Snow sprayed from her boots. A bullet kicked up dirt near her feet, but she didn't flinch. Talon saw her break cover. A curse, sharp and guttural, escaped him. He fired twice toward the Morrow man, taking aim at her, dropping him, then sprinted after her, cutting a diagonal path to intercept. Elias saw her coming. Hatred twisted his features. He raised his pistol, not at the warriors, but directly at his daughter. "Defiant bitch," he spat, aiming. Eliza skidded to a halt 10 paces away, directly in his line of fire. Time slowed. She saw the barrel, the glint of the hammer, the cruel certainty in her father's eyes. She saw Billy, sobbing in the snow, the rope cutting into his wrists. And she saw Talon, closing fast, rifle discarded, his long skinning knife drawn, his face a mask of primal fury. But it wasn't Talon who struck first. From the shadows near the poisoned creek, a figure lunged. Jed Coombs, somehow freed from his bonds, face contorted with pain and malice, a discarded Morrow rifle clutched in his uninjured hand. He hadn't aimed at the Cheyenne nor at Talon. He aimed at Eliza Morrow. Betrayal, sharp and final, glittered in his eyes. "Should have paid me more, you miserly bastard," he screamed, pulling the trigger. The shot was deafening at close range. Elias jerked violently in the saddle, a look of utter shock on his face. He stared down at the blossoming crimson stain on his expensive wool coat, then slowly, ponderously, slid sideways off the black gelding, hitting the frozen ground with a heavy thud. The gelding shied, dragging Billy a few feet before the rope went slack as Elias lost his grip. Coombs didn't wait. Dropping the rifle, he turned to flee into the darkness, clutching his broken wrist. A Cheyenne arrow found him before he took 3 steps, dropping him silently into the snow. The sight of Eliza Morrow falling, the shocking betrayal, broke the remaining Morrow men. Those still mounted turned their horses and fled back up the pass, abandoning their wounded and dead. The Cheyenne warriors let them go, turning their attention to securing the field and tending to their own injured. The sudden silence after the cacophony of battle was profound, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of the few remaining torches guttering in the snow. Eliza stood frozen, staring at her father's body. Not grief, not triumph, but vast, hollow numbness washed over her. The source of her poison, the architect of so much pain, was gone. Talon reached her side, breathing hard, his eyes scanning her for injury before flicking to Elias. He said nothing, just placed a steadying hand on her shoulder for a brief moment, a silent anchor. Billy Sears scrambled to his feet, trembling, the rope still dangling from his wrist. He looked at Elias, then at Eliza, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. Eliza moved towards him, her movement stiff. She pulled Thomas's knife and carefully sawed to the rope binding him. "Go, Billy," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Get your horse. Go home. Tell them Eliza Morrow fell to his own poison." The boy didn't need telling twice. He stumbled toward a riderless horse, scrambled onto its back, and fled into the retreating dawn. Morning Star approached, Kai beside her. The elder woman looked at Elias's body, then at Eliza. There was no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding. "Billy is gone," she stated simply. "The poison stops." She placed a hand on Eliza's arm. "The water will find clean source. The valley heals." She gestured toward the camp, where warriors were already checking the fallen, helping the wounded Cheyenne back. "Your place is here, Vikasia. Morning light comes." The weight of the words, the acceptance, finally pierced Eliza's numbness. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her eyes, not for Elias, but for the ending of a long, bitter winter. She nodded, unable to speak. The next hours were a blur of necessary tasks. Tending wounds, clearing the battlefield with solemn respect for fallen, checking the upstream source of the creek, a tainted waterskin dumped near a feeder stream. The immediate threat was over. The cost had been paid. 2 Cheyenne warriors lost, several wounded, including Lean Bear with a bullet grazed to his arm. But the camp stood. Coyote's playground remained theirs. As the true dawn broke, painting the snow-dusted peaks in hues of rose and gold, Eliza found herself by the creek again, downstream from the camp. The water here, further down, ran clear and cold over stones, untouched by her father's malice. She sat on a sun-warmed boulder, the earth-red blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the light spread. Her bandaged hand rested in her lap, the dull ache a reminder of the fall, of Talon's care of the fight. He came silently, as he always did, settling onto the boulder beside her, not too close but present. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the creek's song and the distant sounds of the camp stirring. He held something small in his hand, a simple, smooth stone, dark gray shot through a vein of white quartz, like a frozen lightning bolt. "For a mana," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. He skipped the stone across the clear water. It danced 4 times before sinking, her spirit free now, like the water. He looked at Eliza, his dark eyes holding a depth of shared sorrow and hard-won peace. Thomas, Eleanor, their spirits too. Eliza understood. He was releasing the ghosts, not forgetting, but letting them flow with the current of life, not anchor him in the poison of the past. She reached into the neck of her dress and pulled out the brass locket. She clicked it open, looking at the faded wisp of her mother's hair, the tiny portrait of Thomas as a young boy, forever smiling. She had carried their memory like a weight, a burden of loss and shame. Now, looking at the clear water, at the strong, quiet man beside her, at the camp waking to a new day behind them, she knew what she had to do. She closed the locket. Without a word, she slid off the boulder and walked to the water's edge. She found a spot where the bank was soft. Kneeling, she dug a small hole with her uninjured hand, deep enough. She placed the locket inside, the brass catching the dawn light for a moment before she gently covered it with dark, rich earth. It wasn't a grave, it was a planting of memory, no longer a chain, but a seed of the life she had lived, buried to nourish the life she was beginning. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. Talon watched her, understanding dawning in his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply offered his hand. She took it, his callous palm warm and strong against hers. Together, they turned and walked back toward the camp, towards the smoke rising from the morning fires, towards the voices of the people, towards a new day dawning in the valley called Coyote's Playground. The unwanted daughter had found her kingdom, not in gold or land, but in the quiet strength of a warrior's hand, the steady wisdom of an elder's eyes, and the hard-won peace of belonging to the earth and to those who cherished it. The queen of the morning light had come home.